Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Lowe. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, David.
Well, I'm glad you could all join us, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. I feel like I should have a fire in the fireplace or something like that, because I'm going to tell you a story, even though I don't have the complete ending, but it is a story that takes us through a lot of different aspects of the research and communities, and everything from community-based research to biomedical research and engineering and microbiology and everything in between. So I'm going to tell you about the Salton Sea, and the story is about the health disparities and the ongoing environmental crisis in the region. So the Salton Sea is an ecosystem that's undergoing a chronic environmental crisis. It's a big lake. It's California's largest lake, in case you didn't realize that, but it's been drying up, and it has resulted in a very stressed ecosystem. And the surrounding area is plagued with high dust levels and impacts on the local wildlife. But of course, one of the most important impacts is on the residents in the area. So this is a human health detective story. And what we want to do is try to dissect the aspects of this health story and not simply dismiss it as yet another health disparities kind of problem, because it's a more complex set of interacting factors. And so there's this uneasy relationship between this declining ecosystem and the human residents, but also a larger question of policy and how we address a lot of these kinds of problems that are in many ways essentially a man-made problem. First, I want to make sure that I've done a shout out to this team. We have an incredible interdisciplinary and collaborative team covering the whole range of specialties and expertise, ranging from Ann Cheney in the School of Medicine, who's working with us in the community engagement, Will Porter in environmental sciences, Emma Aronson, David Cocker in chemical and environmental engineering, and of course the co-director of our Center for Health Disparities Research, Juliet McMullen in CHAS. The center is mainly funded through the NIH, the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. So certainly want to make sure that they get full credit for having supported such a large and complex project. As I said, the problem is based in the California Salton Sea. As I said, it's California's largest lake, and I find that interestingly, many residents in Southern California actually aren't even aware of its existence. And you can see from the map here that it's quite close. It's really right there near Los Angeles and San Diego, two of California's largest cities. It's just a few hours drive to the east, and there's the arrow pointing that. Now, the Salton Sea is in a depressed area east of the mountains here. And over millennia, this sea has been, on occasion, been an ocean, an inlet, a dry salt flat, as well as a lake. And in the past, it has been known as Lake Cahuilla, which went as far as Palm Springs. And it still previously and still supports several Native American communities. The most recent version of the Salton Sea was created in 1905 when an irrigation canal emptied the Colorado River into a dry salt flat and created the Salton Sea. And what we have there now is basically the remnants of that event. The Salton Sea is still, as is for most of California, is a desert. And it's a desert that is also quite windy. And in the area north of the Salton Sea, we call it the Coachella Valley, has a wide variety of communities, from the high socioeconomic status communities such as Palm Springs, Palm Desert, and so on, as well as the lower socioeconomic status agricultural worker communities such as India, which is predominantly Latino. South of the Salton Sea, you have the Imperial Valley, and it is also a major agricultural economy, and it produces about $1 billion in crops every year. But as I said, it's a desert, and it's a very windy one. So you can see, if you drive into the area, all of the windmills taking advantage of the strong prevailing winds. And you can also see that the area is subject to frequent dust storms. Now, it certainly hasn't stopped areas from having the Coachella festivals during the years and so on, partly because the weather during the rest of the time is so nice and warm. Now, because the lake was established because of the draining of the Colorado River into this dry lakebed, the maintenance of the lake has depended on a continuing agriculture runoff and a few very small rivers that run into that area. And in recent years, that runoff and contributions of fresh water into the Salton Sea have really been dramatically reduced. And as a result, the Salton Sea has been retreating even more rapidly in recent years. And as this map here shows, you can see that in only a couple of years, there's going to be, in that yellow area, a huge amount of lakebed that's going to be exposed. And in a few years after that, even greater amounts, partly because it is a relatively shallow lake because it was a dry salt flat. Now, as the lake bed is exposed, the playa, the prevailing winds stir up a lot of the dust. And so this dust emissions is one of the things we're mainly concerned about in the discussion today. The other part of the situation is that as the lake dries up, the water doesn't get continuously refreshed with fresh water. And so as it's dried up, it's become almost twice as salty as the Pacific Ocean. So what's the impact of that drying up? And the most obvious one is that stressed ecosystem. As it dries up, you have impacts on the fish that live in the lake. Now, when it was first established, a lot of the fish came in from the Colorado River, but it was also stocked with game fish and so on, and it contributed to this kind of resort economy in the early days of the Salton Sea. But as it's dried up, many of the increasing salinity effects have basically killed off a lot of the different fish species, and the stress has caused a lot of numerous fish die-offs, as you can see in the picture on the left. The Salton Sea also is right in the path of the Pacific Flyway. So it's a north-south flyway for migratory birds. And you can see that it had millions of birds stop by to eat the fish and eat the insects and things like that. But again, as the ecosystem has been stressed, there have been bird die-offs as well. A few years ago, there was a cholera outbreak and hundreds of birds died right at the Salton Sea. So you can see there is a stressed system due to the changing nature of the Salton Sea. Of course, we are most concerned about the human population. And you can see the postcard on the left was from the heyday of the resorts that grew up around the Salton Sea. There was boating, game fishing, a lot of activities on the water. But over time, even though there was this resort economy and a huge real estate boom, as the lake had begun to retreat and other kinds of ecosystem effects took place, these resort towns really began to be abandoned. And now you can see that it's largely pretty desolate communities with people there are still people who live there, but it is not not nearly as active an economy as it used to be. So there's still hundreds of thousands of people live near the area, and now it's limited mostly to the agricultural economy rather than the resorts. In the eastern side of the Coachella Valley, again, north of the Salton Sea, where there you have the, in India, you have the date palms, you have other agricultural activities. You can see the living conditions, again, is dominated by, you have a lot of trailer parks, but a lot of these kinds of dusty areas because of the desert climate. So what is the impact in the communities? Well, the communities who live in that region near the Salton Sea are very concerned because the feeling is that the Salton Sea, as lovely as it is, actually has a major impact on the health. So there is a desert, there is the windy conditions and the dust that's produced, and there seems to be a strong association with childhood respiratory distress, allergies, nosebleeds, and so on. And unfortunately, for many times during the year, with the frequent dust storms, the kids have to stay indoors to avoid the dust. So what are the actual numbers? Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of detailed epidemiology, but we do have sufficient information to be concerned. At the level of the health assessment studies that have been done in this part of Riverside County and Imperial County, we have evidence that the childhood asthma levels near the Salton Sea in eastern Coachella Valley, as well as in Imperial County, are about 3 times the incidence in the rest of California. And actually, in a recent survey in an elementary school population in Imperial County, the symptoms, the prevalence of symptoms such as wheezing and coughing suggests that, in fact, even if you don't have an explicit clinical diagnosis of asthma, in fact, the incidence may even be higher than the numbers I suggested. And we certainly need more detailed epidemiology to get a clearer picture of what's going on. This is a big contrast, though. If you go further north to areas such as Palm Springs, you don't have the same incidence of asthma. Now, if we looked at it from the point of view of health disparities, we can say, well, of course, the higher income people in Palm Springs are healthier, and the people in the lower income communities near Salton Sea are basically a health disparities question that is usually studied in the context of what we call social determinants of health, right? Are there ethnic or cultural factors? Is it economic disparities? Is it access to care, or other kinds of factors? And what the story is I'm trying to tell you today is that it's a little bit more complicated because we have this other factor, which is the dust, and how that may play a role in the health disparity that really may be obscured by attention to this, what we would normally consider social determinants of health. Now, if dust is the factor, then the question is, how is it impacting these communities that we are concerned with here? Well, one way we've looked at this is to have conversations with the communities that are affected, and they have lots to tell us. They are concerned about, you can see here quotes from people in the communities in eastern Coachella Valley. They talk about asthma, allergies, bronchitis, coughs, and they generally point to the impact of the Salton Sea. The winds, it produces the dust and it affects the kids. And so the community who has this lived experience is telling us that we should be paying attention to what's going on at the Salton Sea. So I'm going to take a moment to tell you a little bit about asthma, because this is something that we're putting more of the focus on because of the impact of the dust in the Salton Sea on health. And it's because of the severe health as well as economic impact of the asthma in these communities. So this is a drawing, sorry I did it with my own hands here. This is a drawing, a schematic of the lung. And the idea is that as you inhale, the air comes in, it passes through the major airways and then smaller airways and so on into the lung tissue, which is comprised of a lot of little pockets called alveoli. And the alveoli, once you have the air pass through the airways, the alveoli have the blood vessels where gas exchange occurs, where oxygen from the air gets into your bloodstream and the CO2 exits the bloodstream and gets exhaled. Now, in asthma, the conditions around that tissue are dramatically changed. So what happens is that there's inflammation and other tissue changes that restrict the airflow through those airways. So it's more difficult for the air to reach the alveoli where the gas exchange occurs. So in essence, asthma is a disease of the airways where the conduits where the air passage happens. Now, the inflammation actually has longer term impacts because the inflammation also causes changes in the tissues, such as fibrosis and other remodeling changes that can make those restrictions in the airways worse and more chronic or even permanent. So asthma, even though it can start as in children, becomes a chronic disease, and at best we have medical management of the symptoms, but there is no cure and no reversal. And the impacts are huge because it means that these are people who have poor access to things like activities, outdoor activities. It affects their learning in school. It affects their ability to handle jobs and so on. And so now you're condemning a population to a chronic disease with no cure and severe impacts on their life course. So returning to the question of the dust and what's going on here. There's another picture by the Salton Sea, and you can see a dust storm off in the distance. So the dust is associated with the effect. Now, simply saying it's dusty answer, that's really not enough. We know there are dusts in other parts of California, other parts of the country, other parts of the world. We see a very specific association here. And what we wanted to do is to try and dissect this question. If it were simply dust, that may be one thing, but are there some things associated with the Salton Sea and the dust that we can understand that lead us to understand how asthma and respiratory diseases are occurring in these communities, and maybe give us some clues as to how to address this from a healthcare point of view? Well, first, we can look at this in terms of how the dust actually is distributed in this region. There's a map you can see here of the Salton Sea and the communities both north of the lake as well as south of the lake. You can see Torres Martinez to the north and Westmoreland, Brawley to the south in Imperial County. And this diagram on the right shows dust levels, and you can see that in different seasons of the year, as well as different times of day, the dust levels do change. And so with the desert and the emission of dust at the Salton Sea, you can see that depending on where you are, you're going to be exposed to varying levels of dust at different times of year and different times of day. To give a little bit more detail on how that dust is going to be blown around and it's going to impact different communities, here's another map. This is focused on the northern Coachella Valley. And this is going to show data generated from the monitoring station at Torres Martinez. Now, this diagram shows dust, different particles and the amounts of the dust particles and where it's coming from. So this is from Torres Martinez. And the darker orange and reddish colors indicate higher concentrations of material that's blown around in the aerosol particulates. You can see that in the spring, more of the dust is coming from the northwest. That is coming from Palm Springs, the LA basin, things like that. Whereas in the summer, let's see if you can see that. So this is the spring. You can see that most of the dust is coming in from the northwest. Whereas in the summer, a lot of that particulate matter is coming in from the southeast, which means it's coming off of the Salton Sea and the desert areas behind it as well. So you can see that there's a lot of seasonal variation in where the dust is coming from. So it also means what material is being blown towards you is changing. So as we already pointed out, communities like Palm Springs are not as severely impacted by the health effects of the dust and the asthma and so on. So it's likely that the dust coming here in the spring from the northwest, Palm Springs, may not be having the same kind of impact as the dust coming in from the southeast in the summer that's coming off of the Salton Sea. Now, the effects of this dust may not just be limited to the region right up close to the sea, because if you look at the distribution of dust that's generated near the Salton Sea, for much of the time, the distribution of the dust is focused near the Salton Sea. However, at various times, any of you who live in Southern California have heard of the Santa Anas, and you know that the winds are blowing very strongly from the east toward the coast. So a lot of the dust generated in that region is now going to be transported to the west. And communities that are right in line are areas such as San Diego, for example, Orange County, and so on. So the impact of the dust generated in the Coachella Valley may have impacts far beyond that local area right near the Salton Sea. So a little summary then to where we are is that depending on where you live, there are seasonal winds and the dust storms that expose you to the different dust. And if we think that the dusts are associated with pulmonary disease, asthma, and things like that, then it seems to matter where the dust come from. And we're interested then in the question of, if the dust source matters, what's in the dust and what is it doing? Well, looking at how dust is generated and what the components are, we can point to two major sources. Because it's a desert in that region, a lot of the dust is generated just basically from the geology, the sand and the soil that's out there and it's exposed, and that's the playa that's here. And as the lake dries up, the lake bed is exposed, and a lot of that material can come from there. Another source is from the Salton Sea itself. So the water generates what we call sea spray. And so there's dissolved chemicals, there's microbes in that ecosystem and other material that's there. So we looked at the components of the dust to see what types of materials are in the dust and whether we can look at what those different components are that may contribute to impacts on health. Here's a crude analysis of dust that were collected near Palm Springs. And you can see that there's all this other material, and the green, I'm pointing to the green part because it shows organic material. So you have various kinds of mineral sources, sulfate, ammonium nitrate, and chloride and things like that. However, when we look at dust that's collected near the Salton Sea, you can see that so much more of that material is organic. All right, so it's green here. A huge percentage of that is organic. So what is organic material? Organic material can include things like, say, plant materials are organic, although plants don't generally produce dust necessarily. But organic material can also include things like bacteria, algae, fungi, things like that, things that are live organisms that have organic material in there, and they can degrade, decompose, and contribute to the dusts that are in the air. One of the major sources of organic material then are the microbial components. So as I said, we're looking at sources in the Salton Sea. And so as an ecosystem, it has microbial components. There's bacteria, there's algae, there's fungi, and all that live in the Salton Sea. And this is kind of a general analysis of the different types of species of bacteria that live in the Salton Sea. And you may not have thought about this, but of course the same is true in the Pacific Ocean, that there is also a microbiome that has different types of bacteria, fungi and algae and things like that. So the different makeup of the different ecologies in there will provide different types of material to that organic fraction in the sea spray and in the aerosol particulates that you breathe. So now the question is, when we think about all the different materials, what can they contribute to the impact on your lungs if you breathe them in? So as I said, we talked to the communities and they live in the area, so they're pointing to something going on near the Salton Sea. And so now we want to look at this question, and we go back into the lab and they ask this question a little bit more kind of a lab bench dissection kind of approach. In this case, what we've done is we want to mimic the effects of exposure. And so we use laboratory mice to test that question. So we can generate aerosols under laboratory conditions, expose them to mice and see what the impacts are and see if they give us clues to what may be happening in communities where people live near the Salton Sea. So our working question, our hypothesis is that do the aerosols generated at the Salton Sea play a role in lung inflammation and asthma? So to test that, we have to collect materials to generate our laboratory aerosols. So one source is these passive dust collectors on the left, and they're basically bun pans with marbles in them. And as the air flows across these, they're sitting on posts, as you can see. The dust that's in the air can get trapped in those marbles and fall to the bottom of those pans. And then we can extract the material. And in these studies, what we did is we actually take water and extract the material collected from those dust collectors, and then use that material. Another type of material we work with is actually going straight to the Salton Sea and collecting water directly from the sea. Now here, we're actually collecting water from the surface. So we constructed a water skimmer that floats on the surface because that's where the sea spray is generated. And we also know that a lot of the microbial ecology lives near the surface of the water there too. So we have a pump, and we send that float out there, and then we pull in that water, and then we take it back to the lab and we filter it. So now we can generate our laboratory particulates and then expose them to mice. Here's a schematic of the the environmental exposure chamber that we built in the lab. Now you can see in the chamber here, unfortunately, they look a little bit more like tadpoles rather than mice, but take my word for it, they're actually mice. And so we have an air system that filters the air, and then we generate aerosols in the lab of really carefully defined size and concentration in the air suspension. And we can inject them into this chamber and expose the mice to this aerosol at a steady state concentration over a period of, say, 1 week, or in some cases, we've gone as long as a month. And this is a picture of the lab where you can see we have an exposure chamber here, and we have equipment for analyzing the particulates in the aerosols. And we also have a control chamber where they only get filtered air and they don't get exposed. So we have a direct comparison to the control mice. So if we have carefully defined aerosols that we've generated in the lab, what are our goals in terms of doing these exposure studies? This is a section of a lung from a mouse where we made aerosol suspensions of little fluorescent beads. And what I wanted to show here is that if we make this aerosol suspension, if we do this carefully, the aerosols get deep into the lung tissue, so we get exposure to all the different aspects of the lung. So when we do the exposures, we can assess what is the impact on the entire tissue of the lung. So you can see that uniform distribution of beads in the lung here. So now the question is, what happens? Our initial studies were kind of interesting because when we took the water, the aqueous extracted material from the passive dust collector, we had taken dust near the north shore of the Salton Sea. We had done the aqueous extracts and we generated these laboratory carefully defined aerosols and exposed mice to them for a week. Now, what we can see here is these red arrows point to the fact that in the lungs of these exposed mice, we saw significant infiltrates from inflammatory cells called neutrophils. Now, these neutrophils are generally inflammatory cells in response to things like infection and so on. So this was quite impressive to see this dramatic recruitment of inflammation in the lungs of these exposed animals. In comparison, if we take dust collected near Palm Springs and we do the same aqueous extraction and the exposure, we see none of that. So clearly the dusts near Palm Springs don't have the same material that induce this kind of inflammatory response. Okay, so this is interesting, but it's not a complete answer. And the reason I'm saying that is because the inflammation we see here is not the same as the asthma that we're interested in the community. Asthma, as I mentioned, is an inflammation in the lungs, but ask any pediatrician, asthma is generally associated with allergy and allergic inflammation. And what that means is that in the lungs and even in the bloodstream of patients with asthma, you generally see eosinophils, which is a different type of inflammatory cell. You may also see neutrophils, but eosinophils are a hallmark of allergic inflammatory responses. And we can use our system to generate a very nice, convincing allergic inflammatory response. In this case, we use Alternaria, which is a household mold, which many of you probably have in your fridge right now. I'm sure we do. And exposure to that produces an allergic response. And when we use our chamber to do this, we see an inflammatory response and a really generous recruitment of eosinophils. So this is our gold standard of an allergic inflammatory response that we associated with asthma. However, I just told you that the Salton Sea dust did not trigger eosinophils. So we don't have a classic allergic, inflammatory, or allergic asthma pattern. So we still have a puzzle that we need to solve. So, okay, so far we have evidence that the aerosols from the dust near Salton Sea can produce a kind of inflammatory response. However, it is not what we had been looking for, which is an allergic inflammatory response. So, but something still is going on. So now to try and, so our next step was to try and look closer at the Salton Sea itself. And what we did was we, as I showed you, produced these skimmers and collected Salton Sea water itself and used that in our exposure studies. Again, with the environmental exposure chamber, we generated laboratory, uniform, fine aerosol particles and did the chronic exposures. For comparison, we also did the same thing with Pacific Ocean water. We went to the beach. Well, I went to the beach. collected Pacific Ocean water, we filtered it, and we did the same exact thing. So it's not just salty water. We made aerosols and we from Pacific Ocean water and did chronic exposures as well. In this case, the Pacific Ocean water had absolutely no effect. We saw no inflammation, almost no response in the tissues as well. So that's a relief for those of you who live near the ocean, but perhaps not so much a relief for those of you who live near the Salton Sea. But what does that mean? These images are a summary of data. So each of the dots on these figures is an individual mouse that we had studied in the environmental chamber. And it's a summary of a lot of different data, mainly gene expression, and I'll get to that in a sec. And you can see that in mice that were exposed simply to filtered air, they all seem to behave very similarly, and they all fit into this kind of oval, and they cluster together. In contrast, the animals exposed to the aerosols generated from Salton Sea, but they are quite different and separate from the control group. I point out here that the Salton Sea exposures were from Salton Sea water collected from a couple of different sites, Salton City, North Shore, as well as collected from different dates during the year. So the fact that they showed similarities in terms of the way the animal responses are clustered suggests that the response we're seeing is a characteristic of the Salton Sea and not an accident of when we collected and where we collected and so on. On the right, you can see that if we do a similar comparison, not just with Salton Sea, we can compare to the Pacific Ocean exposures, and these are the mice here. And you can see again, they, as I said, the Pacific Ocean induced almost no response at all. And that is clearly different from the clustering of the animals we exposed to Salton Sea water. Both of those are, of course, dramatically different from the allergic inflammatory response from the exposure to the Alternaria fungus allergen. So we can see that the allergic inflammatory response is quite distinctive from the effect on Salton Sea, and Pacific Ocean is quite different. But the main thing to remember here is that there is a characteristic response from exposure to Salton Sea, and it's quite different from what we see from exposure to just regular old Pacific Ocean beach water. So now this is the only really complicated slide, and I'm not going to test you on it later. This is data on individual genes. So every dot you see on this is an individual gene. Now, if you're not a molecular biologist, summary, genes are, of course, the different components in your DNA that code for different types of proteins that act to do different functions in your body. And so the genes that are activated or induced under different conditions are in response to certain types of triggers, right? So that means that the set of genes that are induced are triggered by certain types of events that your body is trying to respond to. So the characteristic set of genes and the characteristic magnitude of gene expression change is a fingerprint of what's going on and what your body's responding to. So what that means is that if we look here on the left, Alternaria, we see a whole bunch of dots here showing regulation, suggesting that the lungs of these mice are responding to the allergen Alternaria in a very characteristic way, because this is a summary from several different animals. Similarly, if we do the same thing with Salton Sea, you can see all these dots indicating that a whole bunch of genes are regulated by the exposure to Salton Sea. Now, here's the thing. Although both of them trigger a lot of different genes to respond, if we then do a head-to-head comparison between Alternaria and Salton Sea, they're different sets of genes. So it confirms a little bit what we showed in the previous slide, that the fingerprint in terms of the types of genes that are being expressed are different subsets of these immune regulated inflammatory genes. So we are still left with this puzzle. Is the response to Salton Sea, even though it's characteristic and even though it's consistent and quite distinctive, is it related to asthma? Okay, so again, I'm going to pause here and summarize how we got here. The exposure to dust from Salton Sea and Salton Sea spray induces inflammation-related lung responses. Exposure to extracts of dust from Palm Springs area, as well as spray from Pacific Ocean, do not induce strong responses. Now, the response to the Salton Sea is not the same as allergic inflammation. So what is going on? Are we looking at maybe a different type of lung response for people who live and exposed to the dust near Salton Sea? And that's where we are in the story. So what do we know so far? We know that people who live near Salton Sea have a high incidence of asthma. And the notion of the health disparity due to social determinants may be a little bit more complex. We know that the dusts generated near the sea have a lot of different components. And we paid attention in some respects to the organic component and the ecosystem, the microbiome, and so on. But we don't yet know whether there's certain of those components that have certain types of health effects. And we're trying to answer those questions now. We know that exposure of animals to the aerosols from the Salton Sea does induce a response. However, it's not classic allergic inflammatory response that we would expect to see for an asthma-related allergic inflammatory response. However, it is still a distinctive and characteristic response. And we're yet to try and figure out whether it's related to asthma in some way or a disease that looks like asthma. But now answering the larger question at the top is that, is the health disparity related simply to social factors or something else? And one way to kind of make this more complicated is to basically look at this way. Living near Salton Sea is more affordable for the agriculture workers. It's closer to work. There are, the prices are lower than compared to Palm Springs, where it's very expensive. But unfortunately, living in that region closer to Salton Sea carries the additional burden that you're exposed to more of the dust generated at the playa, at the exposed lakebed. So now the question is, as we start to dissect the components of this, what can we do about this? So we are still honestly, in early stage of this, of solving this puzzle. We have suspicion that the lived experience that have been related to us from the communities is not just limited to the question of, asthma and wheezing. There may be larger number of health issues that are associated with living in that area. So is asthma the only health issue? And we need to find out. We need more detailed epidemiology and figure out what's the range of health impacts associated with living in that area. The related question, too, is that because of the ecosystem crisis at the Salton Sea, we already know that there are impacts on the fish that live in the area. And we now are seeing more impact on the migratory birds that have generally used this as a way station during their flying north and south during the seasons. So what's happening? What's happening now? Right now, the state and federal government hasn't spent a lot of time and energy and money on the problem. Right now, the state is doing some demonstration pilot projects to try to reduce dust emissions at the exposed playa in the Salton Sea. It is not, unfortunately, going to change the fact that the sea will continue to dry up and continue to expose more of the lake bed, potentially adding to sources of dust emission. It is not going to change the ecosystem in the Salton Sea water. And so the contribution to the ecology, the food sources for the migratory birds is probably still going to continue to decline. So unfortunately, we don't have yet enough attention to the question of addressing the effects both on the ecosystem and wildlife, as well as in the health of the community. And a more general question is whether or not restoration of the Salton Sea has a specific meaning. What kinds of projects would actually need to be done if we're going to address these kinds of questions that we have? So I want to leave you with a bit of a historical perspective. So we're watching this kind of environmental crisis, and there's health impacts. There's the acceleration of this effect because we haven't changed the fact that the Salton Sea continues to dry up. And we're not seeing a lot of action from the government, whether federal or state, and so on. And there's also the ongoing problem that the communities in that region are also very much underserved by the healthcare system as well. So I wanted to relate that to a historical kind of similarity that in the 18th and 19th centuries, diseases were often attributed to something called miasma. And it's associated with wild swamps and marshes and decaying organic matter. And I thought, well, that sounds terribly similar. And so the question is whether or not neglect at the Salton Sea has created a type of a modern miasma. And I'm not going to read the poem for you, but it is that kind of question. Is the neglect causing an ongoing crisis that is getting worse as we continue to fail to address that problem? So I'm going to leave with this. This is just a picture of some of the websites that are presenting some of the ongoing research, and we are working on publications to get a lot of our results out there in the literature. And so thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.